Okay, hi guys, it's me again going through to the next stage of our research. We have gone away with our list of things that we need to find out. We have gone away and done our research and primary research, sorry, and we have identified, hopefully, the answers to all of the questions that we had. And we need now to present them, explain and interpret them, analyze, evaluate them, and draw conclusions and recommendations from them. So, please excuse the background noise of a dog barking because I've just locked her out, but there we go. Okay, so the first thing is you're probably going to have asked an awful lot of questions. Can you just do, the answer to question one was, explanation to an interpretation of question one is, and my conclusions from question one are, and then question 2, 3, 4, all the way down to question 36 and 37. That's a bit difficult, especially if at the end of that you then ask the reader, dear reader, now if you think about the answers on page 21 to question 1, the answers on page 32 to question 4, and the answers on page 56 to questions 7 and 8, then if you kind of put all of those together, then you get this. I'm sorry, it's just too much. You can't do that. You can't expect the reader to toggle back and forward and to try and join those things together, him or herself. You're going to have to do that for us. So how are you going to be doing it? Well, I suggest you look for a logical structure, because this is going to be quite a big chapter. Now, what might be a logical structure here? Well, you have a number of options. Remember, I said you have perhaps between 3 and 6 and 7, 6 or 7 aims and objectives, each of which left you with some things that you didn't know that became part of your research gap, and you went out to find the answers to those with your own research. Well, you know, if you've got 3, 4, 5, 6 parts to a chapter in subsections, well, that's not so bad, is it? So what you could do is group the answers to each one of the gaps. That may well help you. Then perhaps you've got 4 questions that address the gap that you have on question 2, and 5 answers to questions that address the gap that you had for question 6. I think what you should do is present the data. It might be in a table form, might be a numerical form, figure, some kind of representation and with text, and then explain those things, analyze them and evaluate them. Ultimately, that means what do they mean? For example, a little while ago, Ellen and I were looking for a mortgage, a prêt immobilier, and we went into a bank, and over the counter at the bank it said, 80% of our clients are satisfied, exclamation mark. And they obviously thought that was great. But somebody here wasn't thinking at all. Well, don't you expect 100% of your customers to be satisfied? Certainly more than 80%. And what is satisfied anyway? It doesn't mean really happy, ecstatically happy, believing that the service is excellent. I mean, if I were giving a mark to you, satisfaisant, I'm thinking, oh, it's not a fail, but perhaps 11, 12. So they're saying 80% of our clients think we're worth a mark of 11 or 12. See, it's very, very easy to interpret the things the way you want to see them. I actually went up to the guy behind the counter and said, excuse me, can I just ask you a question about that banner? Oh, yes, we're very pleased. That's a great result. 80% of our clients are satisfied. And I said, well, can you talk to me about the 20% that are not satisfied? Because if they are all clients of yours who have mortgages, prêt immobilier, and I'm here waiting to talk about a prêt immobilier. I'd rather not. We don't talk about them, sir. They're treating us like idiots. They're interpreting that the way they want to interpret it, not the way a reader would interpret it. So remember, numbers, figures, percentages, graphs do not speak for themselves. You need to explain and interpret them. Yes, you may have a clever piece of software or an online piece of software that does the numbers for you, that produces a nice little pie chart and puts percentages on them and colours and a key, and that's wonderful. Actually, it's too convenient. Because when someone else manipulates your figures and produces the graphs, the figures, etc., you are not involved in that process. If you're not careful, you never thought about them, you've never tried to understand them, you never try to interpret them, you just dump them in your work. And it doesn't work because you need to tell us what you understand from a neutral analysis. I nearly said what you believe, but no, not what you believe, but what you understand with a neutral, balanced analysis that these figures mean. It's very easy when you are looking perhaps at the work your department's doing to want to believe, to construe these figures positively in a supportive fashion. But that might not be telling the truth, and it might not be telling the whole story. So you can use pieces of software like SPSS, which is a statistical package for the social sciences, that will do all your number crunching for you, and you can print out all the tables you want. Terrific. But when you do that, because you just throw the data at the software, you're not really in touch with your data and what it means. If you were using, for example, Excel, you're putting the numbers in yourself, you can see and feel the pattern build up before your very eyes. So you can use them, you don't have to use those things. But whatever you do, you have to interpret and explain what's there without bias, with neutrality, being careful not just to try to prove something you would like to prove. That's dangerous. So you need to go all the way through your work. So you're taking a set of questions that apply to the gap that we had for Objective 1. You present, interpret honestly, and explain in a balanced fashion what these things mean and just how good they are. As I've said before, as a result of 70 or 80% sounds like a big number, but it's not good if you were expecting 99. It's amazing if you were expecting 12. Until we have that explanation, it's very difficult to understand what such figures actually mean. That's your job. So at the end of looking at the answers that people have given you to the questions you've asked about Objective 2, let's say, you need then to do a mini conclusion. So in terms of what we needed to find out for Objective 2, it's possible to conclude this. Okay, then you can move on to the next question, the next statement objective with all of the questions that have been answered by the people that you surveyed, sent questionnaires to, etc. And you can do the same thing again and do a mini conclusion. That helps the reader because, as I said before, you're not just doing 40 pages and then trying to get us to add up in our mind and memory various bits that we read an hour and a half ago. You're bringing it together for us. Now we're moving on to the responses that concern the gap from Objective 3, which, may I remind you, was about this, that, and the other. Okay? So you go all the way through like that, which, because you've got a mini conclusion at each stage, is brilliant, because you've virtually written the conclusion. When you go on to the conclusions and then the recommendations, you've already rehearsed mini conclusion for for gap 1, gap 2, gap 3, gap 4, gap 5. You put those together at the beginning of your conclusions section. Okay? So essentially that's what you need to do in this major section, which is about preparing and presenting your data. Now, there is another way of doing it. That's a boring way, but it's effective and it works and it's not a problem and it's quite acceptable. But quite often when you're doing research, you're looking at your results and you can begin to see a pattern. You can begin to see perhaps not in terms of the questions that you are asking, but what the answers you're getting mean. Perhaps there are maybe 7 gaps that you've been looking at, but what comes out of this research is that there are 4 big themes, 4 big messages for the company to take into account. Now, if you feel that when you are looking at your data, it would perhaps be a good idea to cluster your presentation of your research results, your primary research responses, to cluster them around these themes. And then you can explain at the beginning of this long chapter the structure that you're going to use. It could be the one I explained before. I'm going to take you through all the responses that relate to questions, relate to gaps one after another. Or you can explain, okay, when looking at this data, when working on the data, it's apparent that there were 3 or 4 key themes, which are this, 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 and this. I'm now going to take you through each one of those themes in turn and draw in the responses from each of the responses to these gaps as appropriate. Okay, it's up to you, but you need to think of the reader. What is easiest and best for the reader to be able to understand the significance of what it is that you've produced. When I set you group work in class, quite often the way that you go about doing the research, splitting up the task to do the research, to find the pieces of information, to do the case studies, etc., the way you do that is quite often not the best way of actually presenting it. You need to rethink, asking from the client's point of view, what is the best way for the client to receive this information? Okay, so big questions for you to ask before you start this section. The good thing is, as I've said, your mini conclusions to each theme or to each gap and the responses that you've drawn together for them, they have already given you the basis for your mega conclusion in the conclusions section. So I'm about to go on to the conclusions and recommendations in the next section of these pieces of mini lecture to do with this unit. Okay, thank you very much. Goodbye.